Hello, I'm Pagan Elements, or just Elements if you prefer, and this is the first in a series of videos I'm creating to explain the King of Fighters franchise by SNK, including its development, gameplay, lore, and more. The King of Fighters is one of the most elaborate and long-running fighting game series in the world, yet I've found time and time again that there's a lack of resources sufficiently chronicling and explaining all of its intricacies. With SNK's 40th anniversary only days away at the time of this recording, I've decided to create this video series to fill that void. The King of Fighters Explained. The King of Fighters series primarily revolves around the eponymous King of Fighters tournament. But to explain everything about the King of Fighters, we need to go back to the beginning. Further even than the beginning of the series. The first game, the King of Fighters 94, isn't even the first King of Fighters tournament. The King of Fighters tournament originated in Goroden Setsu Shukume no Tatakai, or Legend of the Wolf, the Battle of Destiny, released in 1991 for the Neo Geo arcade platform, and released in English markets as Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters. Fatal Fury is one of the founding fathers of the modern fighting game, released the same year as Street Fighter II, but the King of Fighters references many earlier SNK properties, and its fighting game DNA goes back even further than Fatal Fury. So, that's where our story will begin, with the founding of SNK and the very formation of the fighting game. The precursor to the company that would go on to create the King of Fighters was originally founded as Shin Nihon Kikaku, or New Japan Project, in 1973 when a man named Eikichi Kawasaki purchased an electrical machinery company in Kobe. At this time, video games were just beginning to enter pop culture through the emerging arcade scene. As the arcade market continued to grow rapidly throughout the 1970s, many electrical manufacturers of the era invested in it. So it was that on July 22, 1978, Shin Nihon Kikaku was reconstituted as Shin Nihon Kikaku Corporation and began gradually shifting their focus to the development of coin-operated games. Little information remains of their first game, a clone of Atari's 1976 hit Breakout titled Micon Block, which was released in various incarnations in 1978. That year was dominated by a different game inspired by Breakout, Space Invaders. Every game developer was in a rush to make their own Space Invaders clone the following year, and Shin Nihon Kikaku's attempt was Ozma Wars, one of the world's earliest vertical shooters that ran on the same hardware as Space Invaders. However, it too was overshadowed that year, this time by Namco's attempt at the same concept, Galaxian. Still, Ozma Wars may be the first game to have a life meter instead of one-hit kills for the player. Shin Nihon Kikaku Corporation finally found their first hit with their first color game released in 1981, Vanguard. One of the earliest games to feature 8-directional firing. However, while published by SNK, the game was actually developed by Tosei. In the 1980s, the company began unofficially shortening its title to SNK Corporation, and continued to release games regularly, though the first building blocks of the King of Fighters and the company's true success wouldn't start for several more years. Meanwhile, the fighting game genre was just beginning to evolve. Many early video games were based around sports, so the earliest building blocks came from games about dueling, fencing, martial arts, or boxing. But the point where things really began to take off is 1984. Karate Champ was probably the biggest influence to fighting games until Street Fighter II. It introduced holding back to block, and characters could perform a variety of moves. For signs of its influence, you need look no further than the mountains of competitive martial arts games in the following years that copied its color scheme of assigning Player 1 a white gi and Player 2 a red gi, something that lasted up to Street Fighter. Of major note both in the development of fighting games and the King of Fighters itself is Kung Fu Master by IRIM. Originally based on Bruce Lee's 1972 movie, Game of Death, the title was changed during development to Spartan X to tie into the Jackie Chan movie Meals on Wheels, known as Spartan X in Japan. However, since Jackie Chan wasn't popular in the West yet, it was renamed yet again to Kung Fu Master for Western releases, where it's probably best known for the 1985 NES port, simply titled Kung Fu. While technically the first side-scrolling beat-em-up rather than a fighting game, it's most notable for its designer, Takashi Nishiyama, who would shortly afterwards leave IRIM to work for a new company that had just been founded by the former chairman of IRIM. That fledgling company was called Capcom. And while working there, Takashi Nishiyama would work with Hiroshi Matsumoto to design a game called Street Fighter. It's also worth mentioning that in another decade, a number of game developers would leave IRIM to form Nazca, the team that would develop the original Metal Slug series for SNK. But between Kung Fu Master and Street Fighter, fighting games would continue to develop, gradually adding full rosters of characters, playable females, block damage, projectiles, and more, getting everything set for the fighting game stage. Around this time, SNK was finally beginning to find mainstream success with a wave of hits. TANK, or TNK3 in some releases, was the world's first arcade game to feature a rotary joystick, in which pushing the joystick in one of 8 directions moved the player as usual, but you could also rotate the joystick to change the direction the player aimed. This is also where we see our first glimpse of SNK's future fighting game universe, as the pamphlet for the game identifies the tank's pilot as Colonel Ralph Jones, who would later be part of the King of Fighters regular roster. In the following year, 1986, the company moved to Suita in the Osaka prefecture, and officially changed its name to SNK Corporation. That year also saw the debut of another KOF regular, Athena. In her first game, Athena was the princess of a heavenly kingdom. Seeking excitement, she opened the door which should not be opened, and fell into another world ruled by the evil Emperor Dante, losing her dress in the fall, forcing her to battle her way home in only her bikini, unless the player finds armor along the way. SNK's success continued to pick up that year when they saw their first major US breakthrough release, Ikari Warriors. The game featured the same rotary joystick as TANK, and also featured the return of Colonel Ralph Jones, along with the debut of his future KOF partner, Clark Still, though they were renamed to Paul and Vince for the US version. Ikari Warriors would get a sequel that same year, called Dogo Soken, or Bellowing Atmosphere, renamed to Victory Road in English-language countries. The game's story immediately followed that of Ikari Warriors, when Ralph and Clark were suddenly pulled into the future and/or another dimension where they fight aliens and/or demons. That same year, SNK also released Psycho Soldier, a sequel to Athena's Wonderland starring her modern-day descendant, Athena Asamiya, as well as introducing her future KOF partner, C. Kinso, as Player 2. But this game is most notable for being the first video game with a vocal soundtrack.
Athena's name is magic. Mystery, that you see. Her crystal is the answer. Fighting fair to keep us free. She's just a little girl with power inside, burning bright. You better hide if you are bad. She'll catch you.
It may not sound like anything now, but it was a milestone at the time, and the song would be covered in various KOF games in the future. A clean version of the song came on cassette with the Famicom port of the original Athena's Wonderland game, and the cassette also included a vocal version of Psycho Soldier's in-theme, Kizudarake no Blue Moon, which wouldn't be seen anywhere else until it was covered for Athena Asamiya's leader theme in the home port of the King of Fighters 11, almost 20 years later. The Western release of the port didn't include a cassette, but it still boasted good sales. By the late 1980s, SNK was doing well, primarily releasing sports games and shooting games. Another developer, ADK, had also begun publishing their games exclusively through SNK and on SNK hardware. But what about fighting games? Though several existed at this point, it would still be a few more years before it solidified into a mainstream genre. But 1987 would see some major releases that would have a later impact on both fighting games and SNK. The original Street Fighter predated any of SNK's fighting games by a few years, but it was designed by Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto, both of which would leave Capcom shortly after and come under the employ of SNK, where they would create the Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting series respectively. Street Fighter II would take the world by storm a few years later, but rather than working on it, the creators of the original Street Fighter would be creating their next fighting game for SNK. Various other fighting games would come out in the following years, but it was the beat-em-up genre that dominated the scene. As such, SNK released a third title in the Akari series, Akari 3: The Rescue, with Ralph and Clark now fighting using their bare fists rather than guns for most of the game. By this point, SNK had success and a healthy catalog. Their arcade scene was doing great, but their ports to home consoles had been lackluster. So SNK began creating titles specifically for home consoles. One example is a completely different version of Akari 3 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Many sources claim Ralph and Clark's supervisor from the King of Fighters, Hydern, made his debut in this game, but as far as I can tell, that's only speculation. Another NES exclusive title from SNK was Godslayer, renamed to Crystalis in Western releases, which included Ralph, Clark, Athena, Kensu, and also allusions to Japan's three sacred treasures, which would be a core story element in the eventual King of Fighters series. Meanwhile, the popularity of beat-em-ups led to many games that blended the genre with fighting games, which led to SNK's first fighting game in 1989, Street Smart. Having acquired Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto from Capcom following their creation of Street Fighter, SNK began working with them and ADK to develop an improved version of the hardware they'd been using for the more recent ADK titles. The project developed a modular arcade cabinet that would save costs by having most of the hardware contained in the cartridges, allowing for easily swapping games and cabinets in a sort of half-arcade, half-console solution that would also allow steady upgrades to hardware to be done on the cartridge side, and some cabinets that could even contain up to 6 games. In 1990, this resulted in the release of the longest-lived arcade machine, the Neo Geo multi-video system. The MVS was a resounding success. In addition to being a powerful system when it released, it also allowed arcade operators to save space by rotating out games in a single cabinet, and they could also upgrade to the latest games without having to do any of the complex rewiring other arcade units required. Rather than continue struggling with developing for home markets as new consoles like the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and TurboGrafx appeared, SNK went back to letting other companies port their games, and instead released a home version of their machine, the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System. While the AES provided arcade-quality games in your home, the system and the games were still prohibitively expensive, making it more of a luxury system than anything that would ever be as widespread in homes as the MVS was in arcades. But with the Neo Geo flooding arcades throughout the world, the time came for Takashi Nishiyama to finally make his spiritual successor to Street Fighter, a game that would release the same year as Capcom's own effort at a sequel, and would begin what would eventually become the founding block of the King of Fighters universe, with timeless characters that continue to appear in games to this day. But we're out of time for today, so we'll save that for next time. This has been the King of Fighters Explained by Pagan Elements.